for sponsoring this event and to connect UBC, the UBC Library, and UBC Robson Square for their sponsorship, which made this space available to us. We would like to thank our generous festival donors and sponsors, which includes the Canada Heritage Fund, BC Gaming, Creative BC, the City of Vancouver, DBVIA, the Hamber Foundation, the Joseph Wask Foundation, the Asian Canadian Writers Workshop, Quill, Pace and Associates, the Federation of BC Writers, the League of Canadian Poets, the Writers Union of Canada. For a full list of partners, you can look at the Word Vancouver website. Without all of these amazing donors and sponsorship, this free festival could not happen. If you haven't already, please consider making a donation via the website. Now I'd like to introduce our two speakers. First, there's to my immediate right is Rina Garcia Chua. Rina was the 2022-2023 Jack and Doris Shadbolt Fellow in the Humanities at Simon Fraser University. She received her PhD from the University of British Columbia. She is also the editor of Sustaining the Archipelago, an anthology of Philippine eco-poetry, and co-editor of Empire and Environment, Ecological Ruin in the Trans-Pacific. She is completing her poetry chapbook, A Geography of Unnatural Hazards, which is a visual and poetic responses to cultures and environments. And then next to Rina is Carolyn Nakagawa. Carolyn is a fourth-generation Anglo-Japanese Canadian poet, playwright, and educator who makes her home in the territory colonized as Vancouver, BC. Her work themes, sorry, didn't plan my.
Krisztina, for that introduction. Okay, everyone can hear me? Okay, I'll start off by just introducing the archival collection that the poetry I'm reading today is written from, and that's the Joan Gillis Phones. And I'm going to quote from the finding aid, which was prepared by Claire Williams, who's here today. So it's so great to see you, Claire. And just to give you a sense of what the collection is to start off. So the Phones consists of the incoming correspondence to Joan Gillis from a group of young Japanese Canadians she met while attending Queen Elizabeth Secondary School in Surrey. The Phones includes 149 letters and 10 small photographs, referred to colloquially as snaps in the letters, sent from a total of 13 different correspondents. The majority of the correspondence took place during 1942 to 1946, with different friends writing from farms and work camps in northern British Columbia, Manitoba, and Alberta. So I'll just add a bit more historical context about the Japanese Canadian community and what they were going through at that time. In 1942, the Canadian government ordered all persons of Japanese racial origin, that's the term they used, expelled from the area within 100 miles of the west coast of British Columbia. So this was a racially motivated policy by the Canadian government that was disguised as a wartime necessity at the time. This policy affected the majority of Japanese Canadians who were living within the West Coast, including a significant farming community in Surrey, which is where the collection comes from. And that would have included some students of Queen Elizabeth Secondary. And it also included my own ancestors who were in the fishing community of Steveston. As Williams notes in the finding aid, Joan's friends write from exile in various locations in interior British Columbia, Manitoba, and Alberta. So the sequence I'll be reading from, and you can start the slides now for that, actually come from an invitation I received last year to respond poetically to the Joan Gillis letters as part of the launch of an online exhibit of a selection of them called I Know We'll Meet Again. So I thought we'd share that image there. And I'd like to take a moment to thank Tomoko Kitayama Yen and the organizers from UBC Library and Asian Canadian and Asian Immigration Studies for inviting me to participate in that event, because it was a wonderful excuse to delve into those letters and to create some response to it. And I also want to acknowledge my co-panelists and moderator from that event, who are a big part of how I feel about this work today, Laura Ishiguro, Lisa Ueda, Angela May, and Nicole Yakashiro. So because I wrote this sequence of poems in the context of the online exhibit, which you can still take a look at yourselves when you go home, or if you're at home right now watching the stream, I definitely recommend you take a look at the letters. It's just a selection of the full collection. And I worked primarily with that selection that appeared in the exhibit from a certain selection of authors. So there's 5 authors in my poem specifically. And I just want to include another relevant part of the materiality of the collection. So from the finding aid again, I'm quoting, Gillis kept the correspondence bound in twine or ribbon, which is also included in the phones. A government censor opened and read many, if not all of the letters, and many of the envelopes bear a sticker or stamp marking this. And you can actually see on the slide, some of them, the front one has passed by censor. That's an example of what it looked like. And many of the letters are handwritten, some are typed, and some are written on postcards. So the poem that I'm going to read is a sequence, so it's kind of multiple poems that I originally wrote as one. And it was my own response to the letters that I read. And after I wrote the single poem, I separated them out into the different voices of the 5 authors that I worked with. So I'm going to be showing it just in a moment, that each page you'll see is a new author. And because we're going to show the text, you're going to see the white spaces. And I feel like going through this collection, one of the most interesting things about these letters are what they don't contain. So of course, we've already mentioned that these letters, the ones that were written during the war years, were passed through wartime censors. So things were often physically, or they were physically censored, but for the most part, there's, I think, even a self-censorship, knowing that these were being monitored and read by the censors. There's also, even though Joan herself was clearly a friend and a peer of these Japanese Canadian writers, there's a power imbalance between them, right? She's a white classmate who's been able to stay on in her regular life and carry on. And these are young people whose lives have gone through a huge amount of upheaval. And we don't know what Joan said to them directly. Sometimes it's referred to like, oh, you said this and here's my response, but we don't have Joan's letters as part of this. It's just what she received from them. And I think also one thing is the youthfulness of it and the being in the middle of history as a young teenager. They're often 13 or 14 when they're writing these letters. And there's so many things that they're not able to articulate about their situation. And that's something that I wanted to show as well. So the poems are not verbatim from the text, but they are directly inspired by and paraphrasing the archival materials. So I shared a few snippets of the direct quotes from the text to the side on each page. And I think, sorry, I keep hitting my mask with the microphone, but I will start the reading now. I can start with the first slide. This is Please Write Soon. Well, I guess I better close here, for it's past midnight. It's almost midnight on the prairies, and I'm too tired to think of anything worth blacking out. I'm like a snapshot cut out, only made flat again if I said myself to you. It's a week just for 30 miles, but maybe less if going farther, closer to the blackouts. You write me back promptly, and I ignore you for weeks and months. Snapshots can't harvest beats, or feel hunger, or forget the past. I'm sure you've grown taller, and there are no holes in your date book. Always, Tad. And about your hope. The letter you wrote came to me with black letters reading, examined by censor. Dear home, I'm not ready to remember these years. At least tell me all the filled-in places I'd rather write about. Where'd you get the idea that I write interesting letters? Like your hope, for example, that made its way to me at the edge of a page, examined and crossed out. Yesterday was Victory Day, but we've just as many beats to thin. Send me the warmth and a full, long sentence that no one else will read. Yours sincerely, Jackie. I am hoping that someday justice and true democracy will come to me. I'm too tired to think of anything worth blacking out. When the war is over, I'll give it a try. I'm like a snapshot cut out and wandering the hillside in lambing season. The radio is playing a swell song. I bet you know the words, and every one of them I mean. Like your hope, for example, that made its way to me. Snapshots can't forget the past. Burn it if you can, and send me the warmth. I am, as ever, Yosh. P.S. If you can't make heads or tails of this scrawl, just burn it. P.S. Thanks for the lovely card. Keep the home fires burning. A letter arrives, you tear it open. Dear home, I'm not ready to remember these years, but I have to. It's a week just for 30 miles, but maybe less on the only mail day. Snapshots can't harvest beats, or feel hunger, or forget the past. I'm sure you've grown taller, and there are no holes in that home fire. Goodbye now. Love, Al. I recognized your writing on the envelope and ripped it open and read it immediately. The way how I threw down my hoe to read it, my mother knew who the letter was from. I read your letters, I don't know how many times. A letter arrives, you tear it open. I'm too tired to think of anything worth blacking out. Dear home, tell me all the filled-in places I'd rather write about. I'm like a snapshot cut out. You write me back promptly, and I ignore you for weeks and months. Snapshots can't harvest beats. I'm sure you've grown taller. Say you don't have to keep the envelope. Send me the warmth and a full, long sentence. Your friend as ever, Sumi M. So the final part of the poem that I'm going to read is actually adding one more author, and that's myself. And that's because I can't really remove myself from my experience of reading and writing about them. I'm a fourth generation Japanese Canadian, so I'm 2 generations after these authors, writing about 80 years after the fact. And I discovered this history primarily while being an undergraduate at UBC. And for me, that was the Japanese Canadian history and connecting with that part of my identity was a way of defining how I've always been different. And what struck me about reading the letters from these Japanese Canadian teens, these young teens, is that for them, it was more a way of defining how they were the same. They were just the same as Joan Gillis because they were Japanese Canadians. And that was really important to me and moving because I was connecting to them on the same basis of this shared identity, but also having this totally opposite relationship to it. So I wanted to experience that with them and alongside them. And at the same time, it's always through my own voice. So I'm going to finish off just by reading all the poems together as the original poem that I wrote, just for my own response. And I put the little quotes from each poem on there on the slide while I read the poem. Please write soon. And about your hope. The letter you wrote came to me with black letters reading, examined by censor. Jack Takahashi, May 10th, 1942. A letter arrives, you tear it open. It's almost midnight on the prairies, and I'm too tired to think of anything worth blacking out. When the war is over, I'll give it a try. Dear home, I'm not ready to remember these years, but I have to. At least tell me all the filled-in places I'd rather write about. I'm like a snapshot cut out and wandering the hillside in lambing season, only made flat again if I send myself to you. Tie it with ribbon. The radio's playing a swell song. I bet you know the words, and every one of them I mean. Where'd you get the idea that I write interesting letters? It's a week just for 30 miles, but maybe less on the only mail day, or if going farther, closer to the blackouts. Like your hope, for example, that made its way to me at the edge of a page, examined and crossed out. You write me back promptly, and I ignore you for weeks and months. Snapshots can't harvest beats, or feel hunger, or forget the past. I'm sure you've grown taller, and there are no holes in your date book. Yesterday was Victory Day, but we've just as many beats to thin. Say, you don't have to keep the envelope. Burn it if you can, in that home fire, and send me the warmth and a full, long sentence that no one else will read. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. We can start the slides now. Thank you so much. And before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that I live in the unceded territories of the Silks Okanagan peoples in what is known as Kelowna. And as most of you know, we had undergone a series of frightening unnatural hazards the past couple of weeks. And I take that into account when I write my poetry and even in my responses to whatever it is that I am engaging with in everyday life. So I would like to kind of give an introduction to this project that you're seeing here on the screen right now. And this is a project that is maybe 15 years in the making. And it had been supported by the generosity of the Jack and Doris Shadbolt Fellowship at Simon Fraser University, of which I was a fellow just last year. And I am so lucky that through this work that has been supported, I was able to meet a lot of archivists all over BC. And I was able to do research and be supported by the wonderful people at UBC Library. Claire is here, and she was one of our points of contact when I started this research. And I think the first phase of the project, what you're seeing here is a screenshot from the project itself. The title of the collection that I'm working on is called A Geography of Unnatural Hazards. And it's a poetic response to geography, environment, and identity. So aside from that, this project is also connected to the Shadbolt project itself, which I will show. Next slide, please. And it is a very new website. It's still in the beta process, and I want to then again give my thanks to the Digital Humanities Innovation Lab, Joey Takeda and Ali Moore, who had supported me in creating this website, and of course my poets who have contributed their beautiful words to create this website. The first phase of the website is now done. As I've said, it's beta. You could see the website, the web page over there. Sorry, I was trying to orient myself with where it is, but that's the web page over there, and you can visit it. As I've said, it's still in the beta process, so we're still trying to develop it. And the first phase of the website is to populate it with poems that respond to identity, belongingness, and the environment in British Columbia by Asians in Canada. So this is the result of that. And the lines there are very significant, and they show just how the poems are interconnected and then at the same time fragmenting the geography of this space. The first poem that I'm going to read, we can go to the next slide, please. Connects to the Jim Wong-Chu fonts. And when I do my research, which is the second part of the website, which is to populate with understanding that the archives, there are just some parts of it that I can publish in a digital way and that can be on the website, and that would have to be the second part because there will be a lot of permissions undertaken. So recognizing that, I take a lot of pictures when I do my research in the archives. And the poems that I have right now respond to the Jim Wong-Chu fonts, which is really a wealth of Asians in Canada, community publications, and a trail of people coming together to respond to real life situations that historically have been there from the very beginning of immigration in this country until now. And the Chinese Canadian Research Collection is a big archives. And what was interesting about this archives is that if the Jim Wong-Chu fonts was very thoughtfully collected and curated, the Chinese Canadian Research Collection was basically every single thing that they could get their hands on, newspaper clippings, ads, everything. And it is divided into certain parameters like Filipinos and China, Filipinos, Japanese, and so on and so forth. So there was a lot there. Okay, so when I go into the archives, and I'm very lucky that I was able to delve into a lot of archives in BC during the last year, some questions that I would ask myself are, what do I see and don't see in this archive? Who gets to curate, to choose to keep? Who holds the camera? Who shapes these words? And I think about that because some of the archival material that I'm faced with in such a confined time and space are quite visceral and quite painful. And when the racism is directed towards your ancestors and your people, it's quite hard to reckon with. So the poems that I write are responsive of that pain, responsive of these materials, and responsive of the isolation when you're doing the research. How do I express my affect from these painful materials in the archive? So it's born out of catharsis. And the thing is, I like to think of archives as both liberating and constricting in that way. And my poetry responds to a borderless kind of information, a borderless world, and trying to get that information out there where some people might not have access to these materials. Next slide, please. The quote in the poem I will show you comes from the Asian heritage of New Brunswick. It's a quote that comes from the Chinese labor on the Canadian Pacific Railway. In the Jim Wong-Chu fonts, I found this pamphlet amongst a lot of other pamphlets, quite informative, a brief history of Asian North America. And there's this number there, 1881, that talks about the Chinese laborers on the Pacific Railway. Next slide, please. Another one that had influenced this poem that I'm about to read are the Gum Sanpo publications. There are not a lot of Gum Sanpo, I think, materials out there. There's just two, and I think it only lasted 2 issues, if I'm not mistaken. But they're in the archives. Jim Wong-Chu was able to keep them, and this is a unique preview of Chinese-Canadian life in the Lower Mainland. What's really important about this is that it's about the migrant workers who worked on the railways, and photographs like these, the Chinese migrant workers on the railways, is very, very rare. And I could say that because I've done some research in even the smallest archives, you don't find photographs like these. Next slide, please. So this is the poem. It's called 4 Deaths per Mile. Warning. The Chinese are beginning to encroach upon property in Port Moody, which should be kept free from them. If they obtain a foothold in the central part of the city, that neighborhood will be rendered uninhabitable for white people, and property will decrease in value. Necessity compels us to tolerate a few Mongolians in the community, but let them herd themselves and not attempt to mix in with the whites. There's no affinity between the races, nor can be, in spite of all that is preached about the universal brotherhood of man. This is from the Port Moody Gazette, April 12, 1884. Death is another country. How else do we build your future if not on bodies decaying on the tracks? History is too brief to untamper our stories. All 600 of us roaring beneath you. Next slide, please. On the website, which this poem is included in, I traced the geographical points of the railways and where the labor had started, and I hope this is as accurate as it could be. And if you click on that poem, this is what you would see on the website. So I just thought I'd show you that parallelism. Thank you. Next slide, please. Another thing that I appreciated in the Jim Wong-Chu funds, which really, I think, lasted a while for me and took me a while to reckon with, is that there's not a lot of Filipino paraphernalia that I came across with. I'm from the Philippines. I'm a first-generation immigrant. I moved here in 2016, and there wasn't a lot of paraphernalia that I came across with when it came to Filipino history and Filipino migration in the mainland. And maybe I wasn't just looking in the right place at the right time, in the right archives. However, I was so thrilled to find some paraphernalia about social justice for overseas Filipinos that Jim Wong-Chu had kept. And this was quite influential in my work because these were truthful documents to the experiences of Filipinos, the movement of Filipino labor movement, migrant movement here, as well as the way the caretakers and the nurses from the Philippines as soft body exports of my nation had evolved here in Canada. And so a lot of the stories here, they were anonymous. They were in this and compiled in this pamphlet, but they were anonymous. And I responded to that because these stories are not isolated. These stories are happening again and again. Next slide, please. And these are a series of poems. I'm only going to show two today. This is called Corridor Stories 1, and this is a poem that comes from that pamphlet. Corridor Stories 1. Women are profitable commodities. For a package deal, Canadian men are able to buy a nanny, a housekeeper, and also a sexual partner. This was from the Kalayaan Resource and Training Center towards Social Justice for Overseas Filipino from the Jim Wong-Chu Funds. In Quebec. You see, he refuses to believe there is another word for pain. Aray. I repeat, but he thinks it is the same aray I said when we got married and he slept beside me on my family's banig. Or the aray I spat out when he had to leave me. One last time, he promised. Agoy jud, French is difficult, but I want to learn to explain to him how hard his fist hit my cheek the last time he lost his temper. He promised me more than this dirty trailer in the woods and no sewage. And I have to earn my keep, he insists. I can't see my friends, and he doesn't allow me to send money to my family. Aray, no one understands me when I say it. On the winter street, they stare at me. My tongue stiffens in this billowing of white. Next slide, please. Another part of the Jim Wong-Chu funds that I really was taken by was this slide on Filipino nurses as modern-day slaves. I responded to this particular pamphlet because I remember in March 16, 2021, there was a shooting spree in the massage parlors in Atlanta, Georgia, and it was categorized as a hate crime against Asian Americans. And oftentimes, I find that people in Canada respond to these kinds of events in the US as, oh, that doesn't happen in Canada. That really, we don't experience that here. That will never happen here. But it did happen here. And I remember I was struck by Ashley Noel Arzaga, who was, unfortunately, she was attacked in a massage parlor in Toronto. And she's a single mother, just like I am. My daughter just arrived in Canada last June. And I think about her a lot. I think about what led her to that path. How did she end up in that parlor? What made her make this choice? A choice that I'm not sure if I would have been absolved from if push comes to shove. And thinking about how I'm not really different from a lot of the migrant mothers here. Next slide, please. This is Corridor Stories 2. Ashley Noel Arzaga was a loving mother, daughter, sister, cousin, and friend whose smile and laugh was contagious to everyone around her. That is how the 24-year-old woman is described in a GoFundMe campaign set up to help her family and young daughter after she was killed in North York Spa Monday. This is from Aaron DeAndreas. North York woman killed in stabbing at Spa was a loving mother who had contagious smile in Toronto Star. The map is traced from Ontario's Highway 401 corridor from the center of Canadian Center to End Human Trafficking. What brought you to this foreign city is the same pathway our ancestors took to escape the sea. You traced migrant lines on your palm and followed navigation unknown. We share the same hands. How are we forced to say goodbye? The last poem, next slide, please. The last poem is from the Chinese-Canadian Research Collection. And again, as I've said, it's just a wealth of all information about Asians in Canada in general, not just in the mainland, which I appreciated, but sometimes the viscerality of these materials do come to me. I encountered a very wealthy Komagata Maru materials from the SFU archives. And I find that it's really, again, I might not be looking in the right place, but for example, in the interior of British Columbia, it's really hard to look for archival material from Indian communities in British Columbia. So I looked at these materials and I remembered, again, another event that happened recently with some migrants that tried to cross the St. Lawrence River, trying to get to the United States after their applications for permanent residency was not allowed here in Canada. Next slide, please. This is called A Boat Across the River. Pravinbhai Chaudhary, 49, was found in a marshy area in Axwasni, Quebec, with his wife, Dakshaben, 45, and their 23-year-old daughter, Vidhi, and their 20-year-old son, Meet. A couple of Romanian descent and their 2 Canadian-born children, aged 1 and 2, also died during the failed March 29 crossing. He would never sit in a boat, Jasubai Chaudhary said of his cousin. I don't understand. How did he sit in that boat? This is from Hina Alam's family of Indian migrants who died in Quebec, shocked by river crossing event in Global News. This is our country. When there is no safe land left for my feet, frigid waters are refuge. The boat is land, the boat is land, the boat is my way out. The boat is our country. Death is another country. We're on our way home. Next slide, please. And I just also want to acknowledge the Larissa Lai fonts, and I found this quote there in the SFU archives. And it says in this quote, and I believe this comes from the Haunt of Race. And if I'm not mistaken, I also found this in the Fred Waugh fonts in the SFU archives. And it says, if multicultural policy would tell a history of a nation aspiring to racial equality, revisionist strategies expose histories of erasure and appropriation. Last slide, please. And I'm hoping that with these kinds of poems, I'm able to respond furthermore and open up the archives to a borderless kind of reading and understanding and comprehending. In my language, maraming salamat po. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Those were 2 beautiful and emotional poems and presentations. I have one question I'm going to ask the speakers, and then I'll open the floor to the audience. As an archivist, we often think about, or people's impressions of archives seem to be, or often are, as static, clinical, and logical places. And we spend a lot of time, or more recently as archivists, talking about emotion in archives and reactions and how to care for people that are coming to the archives and having emotional responses to the materials that they're working with. And I think in this case, it's profoundly clear that there is an emotional response to and interaction and illogical use for archives. So I was wondering, and that's not really a question, it's more of a statement, and I'm wondering if both of you or one of you could speak to emotion in the archives, and particularly in terms of your own communities and how they're represented, and possibly how you have helped to care for yourselves through the process of working with this material.
Okay, I'll try to tackle it first. That's a big question. Yes, so looking more broadly at the archival materials that I've seen from the Japanese Canadian community, I think for me there's always a strong contrast between things like the Joan Gillis phones or other writings by Japanese Canadians themselves, where they're speaking, in this case, inarticulately and sometimes very articulately about what's happening and about the significance about it and the weight of their experiences. And reading those materials does have a huge impact on me. I remember, having days where I've been spending in the archives and then I'll go home and just crawl under the covers, feeling all of that emotion from 80 years ago. And then it's contrasted by whenever you go through the government records, there's the coldness of it, the clinical nature of it. And knowing the other side of it, having seen parts of that, that is also a very emotional experience, to see the coldness of it, the remove of it, and to see everything that's missing. So for me, I think there's always that contrast, like who's writing it and why are they writing it? But the emotion is always present because it's about how the lives of real people were impacted, and the stakes are so high. I think Rina's work really shows how high the stakes are for the people who are impacted by this history, whether or not they're the ones speaking in the materials you're looking at.
Thanks, Carolyn, and thanks, Krisztina, for that question. I think when I go into a space that I know has to be controlled because these materials are precious and very important to be preserved for the next people who want to go and seek out these information. I understand that I kind of remove myself from my body because the body feels a lot of things. And when the space and the climate is controlled, I know I just have to get through to the material. I take photos because I review them afterwards. I cannot tell you how many times I've looked at those photos and just processed things. And every archive, every fonts that I open is a relationship. I'm getting to know the person who curated this. I'm getting to know the person who had kept all these records. I'm getting to know this community. So it is a relationship, but it's also, I find what I did not expect, I think, in this research is it's also a relationship with myself, how the process is embodied and disembodied at the same time, how in that moment when I'm seeking out information, I have to be on the task. But after that, and I look at the photos because I do try to group them, try to think about what I want to eventually reproduce in the website, what I can and cannot. That is when the emotions start flooding in. And just Carolyn had said, I remember coming from the UBC archives, UBCV archives, and coming back to where I stay here in Vancouver and just going under the covers and sleeping all day. And then waking up next day is like, oh gosh, I need to go there again. And it's not because I don't like what I'm seeing in the archives, it's because it's emotionally taxing. And for you to finish the task, to go through all the boxes, I find I cannot really feel emotions yet until later on in my own time. And when that happens, that's when I started realizing the necessity of creation and writing poetry that is like this. It's quite cathartic for me. It's healing in many ways.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience?
both. What a wonderful presentation. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, you can take mine.
Oh, it's okay.
Yeah, we'll do this.
Thank you. So I am taking off my archivist hat and putting on my poet hat, and I wanted to ask you about the process a bit more, because from the writing, I felt that this process was different for both of you. So normally, maybe when you go to write a poem, you have a memory or an emotion, or you're being inspired by something non-verbal. And I was curious about, what it was like to instead go to the archives and be with the words of the finding aid and the restrictions, and then the words in the papers themselves, and the paper and the materiality of it, and the voices of the people you were meeting there, how you balance that with your own poetic voice, or the speaker of the poem.
That's another great question that I'll try to do justice to. For me, the process of going to the Joan Gillis phone specifically, the thing that struck me the most about encountering the words of these teenagers was they're young teenagers. They're 13, 14, and you can see that even through like the handwriting and the spelling errors of what they're trying to say. And it really reminded me of what it was like to be 13 and all of the things that you couldn't express at that time. So it was interesting because I don't think it really was. It was actually, I think it's more similar to what you were describing about like the genesis of a poem that's not archivally based. That there was a lot of nonverbal cues that were the things that I was really trying to respond to and give a shape to using words. So in that way, it wasn't actually that different.
I think for me, images were quite striking because, and Claire, I think we've had a conversation about this, because coming in before I came to the mainland, I was looking at archives from smaller libraries in the interior of BC, in other places, and what's available online because of the BC Digital Project digitization, I believe. And, the emotional part of it, and I constantly was searching for somebody that looked like me in these photos, and oftentimes I wouldn't be able to find anybody that looked like me, because as I've asked who holds the camera and who's able to who has the capacity at that time, the resources to record and to keep these things. So I think in my response and in my writing a poem, I keep that into consideration, but also acknowledging my limitations as a writer and as a poet. My words are very limited. It's also restricted by a map, a geography, a line, a border as well. As much as I unborder traditional writing of poetry, I understand that in my limited capacity, as somebody who has access to these archives, who has the capacity and the ability to write this way, I might not have all the words and the information and the experiences of everything I'm reading in the archives. But for some reason, I feel strongly that I feel it, and I can't describe it, and maybe writers here also know how it feels, but it's like a heaviness at the bottom of your lungs that I just cannot remove until I put words and shapes on a page. So that's the process for me, but I'm very aware that I'm not the totality of these voices, that this is just one angle to it. This is what I hope can be said, and what I think I could say in this capacity, but understanding that I work within these limitations. Thanks, Claire.
Anybody have any questions? Yes.
Hi, thank you both for those wonderful poems and for sharing all that history. I guess my question was, you both mentioned the intensity of going through those archives and also of writing those poems in response to this very emotionally intensive things that you're reading. So how do you prepare for that emotional labor of writing and also of going through the archives?
Thank you so much for that question. Unfortunately, I did not think about that. I just dove right in, and I think I was realizing things as I was very lucky to do this fellowship, kind of realizing how emotionally taxing it was on me. Um, I think I tried to process it in a very clinical way as well by supplementing what I had found in the archives, kind of obsessing about it too, just researching constantly about what might be connected. And that's why a lot of the poems I have here also talk about recent events in the history of Asians in North America, Asians in Canada, because these materials in the archives are kind of reminders that these things are still happening. So I just do research obsessively. I let the poem simmer, which is not good, right? It it simmers a bit in me, and then until it's ready to burst, and then I do my research again and again. I don't, I have like 100 tabs open until the poem is ready to be written. And I wish I had a better response. Like I do self care. No, I just do it. And maybe that's not good, right? I do a lot of thinking. Well, maybe not good. While flying and driving, and when I'm in motion, because my poems are in motion as well. But yeah, I wish I had a better answer to that. But thank you. Now I'm gonna think about that. That's very healthy.
I also would like to thank you for that suggestion. Because I also do not prepare myself for the emotional response I'm going to have to these materials. But I think what Rina said about, it's connected to the things that you encounter in current day, everyday life is maybe relevant to that, because it's like you don't necessarily know what's going to come up on the news, right? Like when the Atlanta shooting happened, you're not prepared for those things either. So the archives are just a part of that too. And we do have the benefit of kind of knowing going in that this is probably going to hit us a certain way, and maybe there's ways we can prepare ourselves better for that. But it's just part of the same experiences that affect you emotionally in all of life, and we're both still here, so we found a way to deal with it. Thank you. Let us know if you have suggestions for how to prepare.
Anybody else? Yes.
I'll just yell. Do you think about other people in the future looking at your work in archives? Do you think about how you're putting things into places for other people to look at and research?
I try not to think about it too much, but I do try not to spill any food or water on my papers just in case. That's the one thing I've learned about archives.
That's a very good question. I've been asked that. It's so funny because I've talked about doing archival research at SFU in many different capacities, and in with some of my colleagues at Simon Fraser, they asked me, so are you thinking of having fonts in the future? I'm like, I'm not that special, but then you start thinking about, how do I want to curate my life? What do I want to leave behind? And I'm like, these notebooks. So I was cleaning my place because there's just too many books, right? And I was thinking, all my grad school notebooks and what I've written on that. And I'm thinking, this is not useful to anybody except me and maybe my daughter in the future. But then I realized, this might be cool material for the archives in the future. So I'm starting to think that way. What kind of package or what kind of person do I want people to think of when they look through my materials, if it happens, or what kind of information is available right now that they might not have in the future. And that's why I do believe in digital archives. I'm hoping somehow that it stays. And that's the reason why I also believe in open access work. I'm hoping that this stays longer than whatever my funny notes from grad school would do. But that's a great question, and it's so funny how much I've been asked that in the past year. So thank you for asking that again.
I think as a representative of one of the university archives in the Lower Mainland, I would personally love to see a Rina Garcia Chua phone and a Carolyn Nakagawa phone. Maybe, not tomorrow, but in the future, I think.
60 years.
Yeah. So you have my card. Call me. Anybody else in the audience? Yeah, right at the back. Do you want to shout or should I?
Wonderful panel. Thank you, Krisztina, Rina, and Carolyn. This actually touches on Rina's point about digital archives. And this question is actually for all three of you, but for Krisztina first is, with this new generation of writers who collect materials, not only ephemerally, print, but also digitally, how does one gather, collect, and archive these materials? I know my personal relationship with Jim, that he had a lot of materials that were digitally collected on his hard drive. And they always ask me, it's like, okay, I got all this stuff. What am I going to do with it? I have all the papers, but my computer has a lot more of that stuff. I'm just wondering, based on your experience, Krisztina, how do you tackle these types of questions from authors and writers and really important people?
Oh man, I'm being put on the spot here. First off, I'm an old generation archivist, so I'm not a digital archivist. So I have a basic, very top level understanding of digital materials, but we have a digital archivist starting at UBC on Monday who can then work with, with folks to answer these very pressing questions about digital hard drives. But I think ultimately, how do you organize material is really, there's no right or wrong answer, because every creator, especially for personal archives, will manage their material in a way that makes sense to them. So there's not a template or a folder. It's really how the material reflects for someone who's a poet or an author or an artist, what arrangement makes sense for that person. As archivists, once the material comes to us as to an institution, we have something called original order, respect de fond, is that we understand that the way that the creator has organized that material, which we try to be true to, says something about their process and their thinking and how they create. So we're not trying to impose, we're just trying to protect and preserve how the creator has thought about their own materials.
I'm just going to add to that. I've seen some archives, and I'm not going to mention which fonts they are, but I've seen some archives wherein they printed emails. I think this was in the Advent when emails were just starting out, and they were printed. And sometimes it's just one line, and it's just a whole page. And for me, it was quite daunting to go through those materials, but they were actually quite fascinating. Just the start of that conversation with digital and how it's now printed onto the paper. I think also thinking about our digitized history, especially now that a lot of us live in social media when everything is out there. I have to admit, I'm one of those people who delete social media accounts after a while, and until I finally deleted my old Facebook account, which before I did that, I downloaded, I created an archive out of it. And when I go back to those, because I'm looking for photographs of departed friends, departed parents, I realized there are some missing. So I wonder how accurate it could be. We could think that digitized archives might be the most accurate way, or might be the best way of preserving things, but I'm not sure if, in my perspective, from what I've downloaded from social media, just to keep track of everything, if they're all complete, I feel like they're also fractured and fragmented in many ways. And maybe that's just the way archives are. They're just never the whole story. And that's okay for me. That's why I delete stuff. I delete my profile after a while because I feel exposed sometimes. And whatever's downloaded, that's it. And, just kind of no regrets. And that's what's left. And maybe that's what will be preserved.
Yeah, I would echo that it's with the digital formats and, the different places where digital files accumulate, your email, your social media and everything. It's kind of hard to keep track of what actually is being saved. And it is quite a bit of labor to try and create that archive for yourself. So it's a daunting task for sure. And I don't know what the outcome will be for people, for all of us living in this time, and what that's going to look like when people are trying to research that later on.
We have time for one more quick question. Anybody out there? Yes.
Thank you for your readings. I really appreciate that they extract the voice to the voiceless, some voices in silence for 80 years or more. My question is, what kind of mental or emotional checks do you place on yourself to ensure that the authenticity of those voices are being heard, that you are acting as a conduit rather than a ventriloquist?
Yeah, so the question was about mental or emotional checks on giving voice to voiceless people and how to make sure that you're becoming a conduit rather than a ventriloquist. I don't know if that's my goal, because I feel like it's not really possible. It's definitely something I think about, and I think it's something that I've almost said something about as we've answered other questions, so I'm glad that you brought it up. Yeah, for me, especially when I'm working with this collection, it's the voices of these teenagers. And I know that it's my voice in the poems, not theirs. It's me trying to explain as an adult what it's like to be 13 and trying not to have too heavy a hand, but I know that it's always that's the thing that kind of weaves it together as my own perspective. So I think just trying to be conscious of that and not give too much credit to myself of being just in service of the voices, but to be honest about the fact that it's always going to be shaped through my perspective, and I want to make sure that I'm still centering and respecting the material and the people who created that material. And one of the ways that I do that is by trying to make it visible how I feel about it and what I'm doing with it, so that it's easier to take that away a little bit and have it a little bit of a remove if you want to try and access the original voices a bit more.
Thank you for that question. Great point, Carolyn. I think the archives is already a voice. I don't feel that I give voice to a voiceless. These are already voices out there in many multiple ways. My perspective is that I am also telling my part of this story. This is my history too. And as much as I want to say that, no, it's different now and my experience is different, and in many ways it is and it could be, this is my story too. This is very real, and I write about stories or narratives and in my world, counter narratives that are true to my own experiences as an individual, a racialized and minoritized person here in North America. First, it's the archives that have preserved these voices, and I already realized that. And in many ways, these voices are everywhere, constantly still permeating. And I'm just telling my little part of that story, kind of just a little corner, a little percentage of it. And I don't think, as I've said, I know my limitations and I know what I can do and what I can't do. And I know my own voice in my own perspective would never encompass all of these stories permeating out there. So thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for your thoughtful and thought-provoking questions. Thank you so much, Carolyn and Rina. This session was truly a pleasure to host. Thank you. And please help me in thanking Rina and Carolyn.